Alright, so I recently made a video covering the Blunderbuss and why I thought it was better than the Rapier. Now I want to make a few things clear. I am going to make a follow-up video, and that's what this video is going to be all about. But I want people to understand there's a lot of nuances that go into testing these builds. First off, whether or not it performs better in a group versus solo content or even a smaller group. Also, just certain build varieties. There's a lot of... I read a lot of comments where people were saying one thing was better than another thing, or and then there's other people saying, oh, but this is better than this. So there's a lot of differing opinions. It seems like I've kind of got a gist of what everyone thinks is the best build. Hopefully, if not, then I will say I recommend other people test this too, because realistically I can only do so much. I can only test so much. So hopefully that clears the air a little bit on where I'm coming from. I don't mean to say, you know, this is the best of the best and that's case closed, end of story. There's clearly more testing that has to be done here. And without further ado, I do want to talk about what I changed with this build. And hopefully it's to everyone's liking. And like I said, if not, just run some other tests on your own and let me know what those tests are so I can get a feel for it as well. Anyways. So there's a few things that I did. I first off made a new Rapier with the stained, refreshing moving keen Tondo. This was one thing I read. Another thing is I am running a tuned leather pants instead of wing leather shoes. The damage discrepancy between the two is a little bit noticeable, but it's not crazy. The only thing is I don't have nibble coat. So if anyone has nibble coat, I want someone else to test this for me and let me know the results. Another thing I tested was using keen awareness instead of thrust damage. Thrust damage is a perma empower, which means it won't be as viable in a group. Keen awareness is good for bigger groups where you can reach empower cap without relying on thrust damage. But the one thing is, I did run a backstab test on my previous video, which shouldn't be affected by crit chance because backstabs are always going to be crits. So that's just one thing to note there. And I think that's the two big things I changed for the gear. And then for the weapon itself, we're using this setup, which is the bleed setup. In my previous video, I wasn't using the bleed setup because the build that I used before wasn't geared towards bleed. So that's on me, guys, 100%. I apologize for not getting that correct the first time. Usually I do have that set up correctly, but in that case, that's 100% on me, and I apologize for that. And then the attributes, we're going to use 25, 350, 300, 25, 24. I didn't have the 25 focus threshold, so we were losing that 5% CDR, which did make a slight difference, I will mention. So anyways, hopefully these tests are a little bit more viable here, and yeah, without further ado, let's get right into the tests. Okay, so the first test that I ran was a Rapier setup with elemental ban, so we're going to be capitalizing on that keen awareness crit chance. Overall, it's about what I expected. We were also using tuned leather pants in this setup. And yeah, I mean, there's not much to say. I'm just going to let this play out. There is a slight issue with tracking when it comes to the dummies, which is kind of unavoidable. It's just that the dummies don't have a tracking hitbox that you can lock on to, unless you use lock on, but that makes it a lot harder to actually use your abilities. Our rotation is also slightly better in this test versus our previous test, and a lot of that comes down to CDR. We have better cooldown reduction with the 5% focus threshold, so that helps a little bit. And I believe we were max in power for most of this test. If not, you know, that's just going to come down to slight variance. I did run this test multiple times, so we'll go into those eventually as well. All right, so this is going to be the backstab test. We're still using elemental band, by the way, so we're not capitalizing on thrust damage just yet. Just for the sake of this test, I wanted to run it multiple times to get a feel for it. Another thing I want to mention is that the dummies aren't necessarily consistent or fair, however you want to look at it, because of the fact that they're bugged right now and they don't reset after becoming immortal. So this test is very, very inconsistent when it comes to actually testing the damage here. So you can either take this with a grain of salt or, you know, run your own tests however you want to do them. Basically what I'm just saying though is that it's very, very hard to get a consistent test on this because you don't really know if these dummies have been damaged. However, I did try to make sure that I had dummies that had more or less max HP. So I ran around different strongholds or whatever, and I tested this multiple times. All right, so we're going to be running pretty much the exact same test, Elemental Band with backstabs. We will be using the Thrust Ring eventually after this test, but I wanted to get a very good grouping of tests here so that we could really get a good average. And like I said before, you know, it's very hard to test this on dummies because you don't know if they've been damaged, which is a big problem. And I mean, that's just on AGS for not fixing this bug. Eventually we will test the PVE damage against actual PVE enemies. That should be a better representation, at least more consistent. And we will also test how this pairs with a group with a bleed rapier, which will be a little hard to test, might I mention, because you're not only gauging your own DPS, but also everyone else's DPS. So we'll have to use a PvE enemy for that. And then I'll also test that with 3 blunderbusses as well. All right, so in this test, we're going to be using the Thrust Damage Ring, which is going to better represent the damage in terms of backstabs. Keen Awareness is really good for most things because crit chance is overall better in the long term. You're not always going to be doing backstabs, especially on certain bosses. So for example, the first boss and the third boss of the Hive don't really have a backstab. The second boss does, but especially for the first boss, you know, you're not really going to be doing backstabs, so crit chance is a lot more important. But anyways, this is the test with thrust damage, and overall, you know, I think it will perform better with backstabs. This is also really good for mutations when you have a good clump and you can just burn from the backside. So yeah, that was the test there. All right, so again, for the sake of consistency, we are going to run this test again, just to get a good sample size here. Thrust damage ring with backstabs. One thing that's kind of annoying is the tracking, which I did mention before, but it's kind of hard to maintain backstabs here. But I think overall I did a decent job to maintain tracking on the dummy here. But I also want to make something clear. I'm not trying to debate, you know, whether or not the rapier is bad. It's not a bad weapon. It's still a very, very, very strong weapon, especially in groups, because obviously you're buffing the bleed rapier. But one thing I didn't really go over in my video is that you're buffing your bleed rapier only to a certain threshold, because bleeds stack 3 times, and you know, you're basically reliant on that bleed rapier popping his FNFs. Alright, so now we're going to be testing the blunderbuss. Now this is going to be a front-facing test with my standard blunderbuss build, and we're going to be using thrust damage ring as well, so we're not actually utilizing keen awareness just yet. And one thing that I read is that people have a general distaste, I guess, towards ranged weapons. Maybe I'm wrong on that. That's just kind of the vibe that I picked up. There is sort of an issue with blunderbuss in the way that it functions in, say, mutations, because you are going to need to stay pretty close range, especially on phalanx mutations when the elite enemies have a shield. But it is an option where you can just go very close range and you can get inside of that shield, so you're not being cut off by that. Alright, so as usual, we are going to run this test again. Same setup, thrust damage ring, not elemental band. And I guess one thing to mention is, if you are unbelieving of these tests, by all means you can run this for yourself. Just set up a really good blunderbuss build and a really good rapier build, and run these tests, and you will probably find the same results as long as you're using generally the same rotations. And I just want to make something clear as well. I use both of these builds, and I love running random mutations, and I can just feel that the damage is higher with the Blunderbuss. Now I know that's just a feel thing, but it is a real thing. Okay, so our next test is going to be backstabs with the thrust ring on the Blunderbuss build. And yeah, like I was saying before, you know, I've ran this build in mutations, and I run the Rapier build in mutations as well. I run a lot of random mutations on my server. It's kind of hard to get M3 groups, so you know, a lot of my experience just comes from running random mutations. And also I tend to run ahead a lot because usually it's pretty easy to solo everything as a DPS, and I do that with both builds, and I tend to clear quicker with my Blunderbuss build than I do with my Rapier build. Now I know that is implying that it's, you know, solo content, so it's not fully capitalizing on group content, but like I said before, we will get to that in the later part of this video. And again, for the sake of consistency, we will run this test again on backstabs with the thrust damage ring. And hopefully this is enough data points that we can go off of where we can realistically make a judgment on which build is not necessarily better, but more damage against single target solo without relying on teammates' empowers, teammates' weakens, teammates' skills, other players' bleeds, you know, an FNF player, for example. So there's a lot of variance that goes along when it comes to running in a group, which is why it's very, very hard to test this in terms of group content. For solo content, this is very simple to test. You know, you can just see which does higher damage. Okay, so this will be our final test for the Blunderbuss. Again, same situation, backstabs with thrust. After this, I'm going to put up on the screen all of the kill times for all of these dummies, for both the Rapier and the Blunderbuss, as well as an average for all of those. And hopefully it's realistic. I don't want to make it seem like I'm cheating here or anything. So again, like I said before, I recommend everyone test this. If you're unsure, or you know, you're doubting this or whatever, test this for yourself. Make a Blunderbuss build and just see for yourself whether or not this is true or not. But hopefully this video should be good enough where it does demonstrate what I'm saying here. Okay, so looking at the data here, we can see that the Blunderbuss performed better on everything, essentially. Not only was it better on front-facing targets, but also back-facing targets. There was a discrepancy, I believe, on the second test for the front-facing Blunderbuss. Because it was so low, I think this might be the fact that one of the dummies was already damaged, so we can essentially discard that if we want. But when it comes to the backstab test, I think the Blunderbuss was very, very consistent, and I think that is a very clear test there. I don't think any of those dummies had been damaged before. And for the Rapier tests, it seems inconsistent, and that might be just because of the tracking. I know there was one test where the tracking was a bit off, so that could have something to do with it. But either way, I think this pretty much shows what I was saying in my first video, which is that the Blunderbuss does better on single target. Alright, so that's about it for the video. I know I mentioned that I was going to do more tests after this, but I don't think I can do the justice of testing, let's say, 3 evade players, 1 bleed player, just because it requires a lot. You need to make sure everyone has the right gear, not only for Rapier, but also for Blunderbuss, in order to have a comparison. So there's a lot of work that goes into that, and I don't feel like I should be rushing through that. I want to make sure if I were to do that test, it is as good as it can be. So hopefully at least this is good enough for now. But if anyone wants to test that, specifically the group content with Blunderbuss compared to FNF and evades, I am more than open to that, and hopefully we can get a little bit more information on that. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Apologies for the first video. I know I made a few mistakes, but hopefully I cleared the air a little bit on most of those. So, yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.